Okay, good morning, everyone. How are you today? I hope you're doing well. I hope you had a nice weekend. Certainly, the weather was much nicer yesterday than we have this morning, so it's hard to get awake this morning. Um, I hope you and your families continue to do well under these challenging times. If you can hear me okay, please type yes into the chat window. Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. Okay, gang. So let's see what we have on store for us this week. Okay, you have your second lecture exam of the semester coming up on Wednesday. So 2 days from now will be lecture exam 2. And that will be the major activity for this week. Today we're going to start chapter 12, which is not on lecture exam 2, but which will be on your final exam at the end of the semester. Okay. Do you have any questions at this time about our schedule or about anything that's going on with the course? Okay. So what I thought I would do this morning is start with you by giving you an example of how to calculate your course grades. You know, as we're heading into the bottom third of the semester, it certainly becomes a matter of concern for those folks that want to know exactly where they stand in the course. So I thought I would give you an example today of how you can calculate your course grades. And so what I'll do is bring up an Excel spreadsheet and I'll do an example calculation of a grade calculation. Obviously, I'm going to use fake numbers for all of this, but you could put in your own numbers from your own grades, from your own exams that you've taken. So let me do that at this time. I'm going to go to Excel and give you an example of how to calculate your course grade. Okay. All right. So here we have an Excel workbook. And let me bring up the chat window so that you can get a hold of me if you need to. Okay. All right, gang. So I'm going to do an example calculation of how to calculate your course grade. This is a calculation that you can do with your own exam scores. And obviously, you're going to take another major exam this week, so you could update this calculation next week and get an even more accurate estimate of what your final grade would be. Okay, so let me just lay out the Excel document for us. First, I'm going to put some column headers up here. Okay. So what we want to do is create a matrix where we list our exams. You know, what exactly is it? Well, we have lecture exam 1. We have lecture exam 2, lecture exam 3, lab exam 1, lab exam 2, and lab exam 3, and also your homework. Okay. Now, let's put in the scores that you may have accumulated so far this semester. Okay, you did take lecture exam 1. And so obviously you want to put in your own grade. You want to put in your own grades for the calculation. And I'm just going to put some numbers in here that reflect just random information. The class average on the first lecture exam, if you recall, was a 58%. So I'm going to put 0.58 in there. Now, we haven't taken the second lecture exam or the third lecture exam yet, so we'll come back to that. The first lab exam, the class average was a 63%. the second lab exam, the class average was a 74%. Okay. All right. So that leaves us with a few spaces here, where we don't actually know the outcome at this time. Okay. So everything in yellow is to be determined. Everything in yellow is to be determined. Okay. So obviously we need a number in these places to actually do a calculation. So at this point, anything in yellow is going to be an estimate. Okay, everything in yellow is going to be an estimate. Okay, so think about your personal preparation for lecture exam 2. Think about how, think about the score you got on the first lecture exam and how things have been going. I know these are challenging times, and what I need you to do is make an estimate of what you think you might get on lecture exam 2. So I'm going to put in as an example 70%. That's an estimate. Okay. For lecture exam 3, obviously the final exam at the end of the semester, you also have to, again, make another estimate. And so I'm going to put in a 72 for my estimate for that. Now the third lab exam is going to be on the nervous system, and I'll be sending out information about the new vocab word bank today, actually. And so the third lab exam will be on the anatomy of the brain and spinal cord. And so you need to think about, well, what do you think you can earn on the third lab exam? And so for that, I'm going to put an 80%. Okay. Now, the weights of each of these exams is specified on the front page of your syllabus. So if you have that available, go ahead and pull it out. If you don't, I will put it in here for you. Okay, the weight of the first lecture exam is 13%, and you want to put that in as a decimal, so that's 0.13. Exam 2, lecture exam 2 is 16%. Lecture exam 3 is 14%. Lab exam 1 is weighted at 13%. Lab exam 2 is weighted at 15%. Lab exam 3 is also 15%. Okay? All right. Now what we need to do is get our weighted score. So to do that, you multiply every score in column B by the corresponding weight in column C. So I'm going to set this equal to 0.58 multiplied by 0.13, and that will give me my weighted score. Okay, so the answer you see in column D, row 2 is 0.0754. What I'm going to do is just drag that down and let the computer do the work for me. Okay, so everything in column 2 is in fact your weighted score for each exam. All right. The last piece of the puzzle we need to think about is actually the homework. From your syllabus, the homework, you get 1% for completion of every homework assignment, every lab exercise activity. And you know at this point that you are on the honor system to complete the remaining homework at home. So, you could potentially earn 14% for the entire semester by completing all the homework. So at this point, if you've lost any credit on your lab homework, then simply deduct that in your estimate here at the end. But I'm going to assume for my calculation here that you've gotten complete credit on every lab assignment. And so at the end of the semester, your weighted score would be 14% or 0.14. 0.14 would be the max that you could potentially earn on your homework for the semester. So to get your final grade, what you do is you take everything in column D and you add it together. So this is going to be equal to the sum, okay? It's going to be equal to the sum of all of these scores that are being highlighted, which is, in our hypothetical here, is 0.74, which is a C, right? Okay, so in this hypothetical calculation on your screen right now, this hypothetical student, if he or she had got these scores on their exams and earned 14% on all their homework, their final grade for the semester would be a 74%, which is a C. Okay? So, do you have any questions here about the process of calculating your grade? Okay. All right, gang. So I'm not seeing any questions or hearing anything from you, so I'll assume that you're okay with this. And again, obviously next week, you'll get your exam 2 results back and you can update that score and make it a real score, not an estimate. And you can continue to do that through the semester to see what kind of trajectory you're on for a certain grade in the course. All right. If you're having difficulty calculating a possible course grade for yourself, or if there's something you don't understand, please email me with your questions and I will help you through it. I'll help you do the calculation for yourself so there's no mystery as to your course grades. Okay, one final time before we close that out. Do you have any questions about how to calculate your grade? Okay, all right, gang. Okay, so hopefully that will help you moving forward. Question from Jennifer: will we see our grade automatically this Wednesday for the test? Not completely, Jennifer. There are going to be some essays that I have to log into the website and actually grade on the computer, so you won't immediately get your final grade this Wednesday. It will take me some time to finish all the essay grading. Other questions? Okay. All right. So I'm going to close that out. All right. And so before we begin new content, let me just open the floor. Do you have any questions about lecture exam 2 that's going to happen on Wednesday? Okay, remember you're going to have lecture exam 2 on Wednesday. It opens up at 7 a.m. on the Classmarker website, and you have all day through midnight to complete it. Do you have any questions about anything on any of the chapters that we've talked about for lecture exam 2? Okay, Mateo asks, how long will we have to finish the test? Mateo, you have 1 hour and 25 minutes. Okay, anything else? Okay, gang. All right, so if something does come up, obviously before the exam, you know, we will be having some I will have the lab/office hour after class today. That's an opportunity to ask questions. Certainly you can send an email to me and I'll try to help you. If there's no questions, then what we'll do is begin chapter 12. Chapter 12 is not on Wednesday's exam, but it is the very first chapter of content that will be on your final exam at the end of the semester. Okay, gang, let's continue here. So I'm going back to a Microsoft Word document. Okay. and we will begin notes on chapter 12. So at this time, probably you want to have pages 404 and 405 open in your textbook. Okay. As I believe I've mentioned in the past, the nervous system is a topic that traditionally has been covered in Anatomy and Physiology 2. We have made changes this semester so that you folks are going to get the nervous system in AMP 1, and that will be hopefully a stronger foundation for content in AMP 2 next semester. Our motivation for moving the nervous system into AMP 1 is to help this course transfer better to other institutions. So that's why this has been done. Okay, gang, let's begin. I'm going to give us a quick breakdown of the nervous system organization you see on page 405, figure 12.1. So this is organizational overview of the nervous system. Okay, so obviously when we talk about the nervous system, there's two major components. First, we have the central nervous system, often abbreviated CNS. And when you talk about the central nervous system, you're simply referring to the brain and spinal cord. Okay, this is made of the brain and spinal cord. If we're talking about nervous system tissue and we're not specifically talking about the brain and we're not specifically talking about the spinal cord, well, then what's left? Well, that would be the peripheral nervous system, often abbreviated PNS for short. Okay, the peripheral nervous system refers to all nervous system tissue that is physically located outside the central nervous system. Okay. This is all the nervous system tissue that's not part of the brain, and it is not part of the spinal cord itself. This is the peripheral nervous system. Okay, the peripheral nervous system can be divided into two subdivisions. Those would be the sensory and motor divisions. The sensory and motor divisions are referring to subdivisions of the peripheral nervous system. You see this in the graphical flow chart or cartoon box at the bottom of page 405. And of course, it's going to be up to you during your personal study time to appreciate the organization of the nervous system and how it is compartmentalized for academic purposes, how it is compartmentalized so we can learn it and we can study it. Okay, so the peripheral nervous system is subdivided into sensory and motor divisions. Okay. All right. Okay, so let's see here. Let's talk about these divisions a little bit. First, we have the sensory division, which you may know, you may recall from previous conversations, is also known as the afferent division, A-F-F-E-R-E-N-T. The sensory, also known as the afferent division. Sorry, folks, 6-year-old. Okay, the sensory division uses sensory receptors to deliver information into the central nervous system. Okay. Well, An example of this, okay, an example of a sensory receptor would be your taste buds on the surface of your tongue. Okay. Now, we haven't explicitly talked about what the structure of the taste buds are, and that's something that we may cover at a future time. But at any rate, your taste buds is a structure made of multiple cells, which definitely includes a sensory neuron. Okay, so the taste buds would have been an example of a sensory receptor. Okay. The taste buds contain neurons which detect food molecules and send information in the form of an electrical signal to the brain so that you can perceive the flavor of the food that you're eating. Okay, so there's taste buds on your tongue, which contains neurons that detect food molecules. Okay, by need to proofread my own writing here. By sending information in the form of an electrical signal, and we're going to be talking at great length about that electrical signal here in chapter 12, to the brain, so you can perceive the flavor of the food you are in fact eating. That will be part of the sensory division of the peripheral nervous system of the nervous system. Gang, do you have any questions? Okay, let's continue. All right, so in addition to the sensory division, obviously we have the motor division. The motor division is also known as the efferent with an E division, the efferent division. Okay. Now this division of the peripheral nervous system uses neurons to transmit information from the central nervous system to an effector, like a skeletal muscle, so that you can move your hands and arms or move your legs and run across the grass, that kind of thing. Okay, so this division uses neurons to transmit information from the central nervous system. Take note here on the screen, we're going to highlight the sensory division of the peripheral nervous system moves information into the central nervous system. The motor division of the peripheral nervous system moves information out of or from the central nervous system. Those are key differences. Okay, so let me complete my statement here on the screen. The motor division uses neurons to transmit information from the central nervous system to an effector, like a muscle to contract or a gland to release a hormone, right? Think about the endocrine system and how it releases hormones. Well, many of the responses of the hormones and the hormones that are released are triggered by the electrical activity of the peripheral nervous system. Okay. Now, as we get more focused on what we're talking about, the motor division of the peripheral nervous system itself can be broken down into further subdivision categories. And those would be the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. So the motor division is subdivided into the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. So if you hear the phrase autonomic nervous system, in your mind, you should be thinking, oh, okay, the autonomic nervous system is part of the motor division of the peripheral nervous system of the nervous system, okay? It's very important that you're going to have to organize your knowledge so that this all makes sense. Once again, the motor division of the peripheral nervous system is subdivided into somatic and autonomic nervous systems. Okay. Folks, please feel free to type in questions into the chat window if you have them. Okay. Otherwise, I will keep buzzing along to make sure I get all these notes into you. Okay, so an example of the motor division, of the peripheral nervous system would be exactly what we covered the past 2 class periods, which is the neuromuscular junction, right? The neuromuscular junction is a perfect, beautiful example of the motor division of the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so the example is the neuromuscular junction. Which is made of an axon. Of course, that axon is part of a neuron and a muscle cell that responds to the electrical and biochemical stimulus that the neuron has created in order to contract the muscle cell. So muscle cell that responds to an electrical / biochemical stimulus in order to contract. Let me read the whole thing, make sure it makes sense in your notes. The neuromuscular junction, which is made of an axon, itself part of a neuron, and a muscle cell that responds to an electrical and biochemical stimulus in order to contract. That would be a perfect example of the motor division of the peripheral nervous system. Okay, now as we said, the motor division can be subdivided into somatic and autonomic branches, somatic and autonomic nervous system. So we're going to take this even further here. Okay, we're going to talk about the somatic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is that part of the motor division, which is part of the peripheral nervous system, which conveys information from the central nervous system specifically to skeletal muscles. When we're talking about the somatic nervous system, we are talking about how the nervous system coordinates skeletal muscle contraction, not cardiac muscle, not smooth muscle, specifically skeletal muscle. Okay, so the somatic nervous system conveys information from the central nervous system to the skeletal muscles. Okay, somatic nervous system is part of the motor division, which is part of the peripheral nervous system, which is part of the overall nervous system. Okay, and then we also have the autonomic nervous system. Okay, the autonomic nervous system conveys information from the central nervous system to smooth muscle tissue, cardiac muscle, and glands. The glands, of course, that are going to release hormones into your bloodstream. Or not just endocrine glands, but you could also have exocrine glands, glands that are releasing saliva in your mouth, glands that are producing wax in your ears. Those things are also regulated by the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so in our notes, the autonomic nervous system conveys information from the central nervous system, the CNS, to smooth muscle, to cardiac muscle, and glands, both exocrine and endocrine. Okay. Now, the autonomic nervous system, which itself is a part of the motor division of the peripheral nervous system, can be subdivided into the sympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, and the enteric nervous system. So we're drilling down into even more compartmentalization. Okay, so the autonomic nervous system is subdivided into the sympathetic system. I'll write it out completely. The sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system, and the enteric nervous system. Okay, so make sure that you're organizing this knowledge in your own mind as you study. So if you hear someone talk about the enteric nervous system, sort of the nervous system of your gut, of your intestines. If you hear someone talk about the enteric nervous system, they're referring to a subdivision of the autonomic nervous system, which is part of the motor division of the peripheral nervous system, which is part of the nervous system. Okay, so you really want to organize this in your mind as you study. So let me talk a little bit about each of these as well. Okay. Let's see here. We have the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system. In the sympathetic nervous system, we have neurons which generally stimulate their effector. For example, we would have a scenario where perhaps the sympathetic nervous system is accelerating your heart rate because you're experiencing some sense of fear. Maybe you're watching a scary movie and you get a little bit scared. It will be the sympathetic nervous system that increases your heart rate. So within the sympathetic nervous system, we have neurons which generally stimulate their effector. Okay, for example, to increase heart rate or respond to a threat, your fight or flight response. Okay, so the big deal about the sympathetic nervous system is that neurons, generally speaking, stimulate. They don't suppress, they don't depress, they activate, they turn on an effector, they agitate, they accelerate the effector. Okay, all right. Well, you can imagine if we have something that generally stimulates, then we probably have things that kind of do the opposite of that, and that would be the parasympathetic nervous system. So letter B here in our notes is parasympathetic. Okay, in the parasympathetic neurons, in the parasympathetic nervous system, neurons generally work to calm or relax their effector. Okay, and so an example of this would be the same kind of scenario where we have a parasympathetic neuron slow your heart rate down as you prepare to fall asleep at night. Something like that would be part of the parasympathetic nervous system responsibility. Okay. So again, remember, sympathetic is to stimulate, parasympathetic is to calm and relax. Okay, pretty straightforward, but the devil is in the details. The challenge to you is going to be sure that you appreciate how all of this knowledge is organized. Okay. And then finally, we have the enteric nervous system. In the enteric nervous system, this is made of neurons that are located in the walls of your gastrointestinal tract. The enteric nervous system is made of neurons located in the anatomy of your GI tract. And an example of what these neurons would do would be to help coordinate and regulate the process of digestion. You know, hopefully, I hope that you were able to have a nice meal yesterday on a Sunday, on Easter. You know, obviously, if you had a nice meal, you had to digest it. So the enteric nervous system, the neurons that comprise it, would have been involved in helping regulate the digestive process in your abdomen. Excuse me. Okay, so the enteric nervous system helps regulate and coordinate digestion. All right, gang. All right, folks. So we've made it through the basic structural organization of the nervous system, both the central and peripheral parts. Obviously, you know, at this point in our flow diagram, the peripheral nervous system was more complicated in terms of how we divided things, but the central nervous system is no less complicated. As you will quickly see, there's many substructures in the brain and even in the spinal cord itself. Okay. Do you have any questions at this time? Okay. You know, I mean, you get it. At this point in the semester, you can see that anatomy and physiology is just a whole bunch of memorization. I mean, it's not just memorization. You got to think with that knowledge, but your first challenge is learning all this new vocab and memorizing the things that are important for you to have in your brain so you can think with that information. This is going to be especially true in chapters 12, 15, and 16, which are the remaining chapters of our semester together. Do you have any questions? Okay. Not seeing anything. I hope you haven't passed out on your couch yet. I hope you're not asleep. All right, let's continue. I want to continue by giving you some introductory terminology, some things that I need to know that you appreciate so that we can continue the conversation forward. So basic terminology. Okay, well, first, neuron. Okay, I don't think it gets too much more basic than that. A neuron is a cell of the nervous system that can generate electrical signals and usually, under most normal healthy circumstances, and usually does not reproduce itself in the adult body. So a cell of the nervous system that can generate electrical signals and which does not usually reproduce in an adult body. Okay. I mean, I think you can kind of appreciate that from your own life's experience, right? You probably know people, or at least have heard of people that have had traumatic issues with strokes, where some of the neurons in their brain have died. In such a case, typically the outcome of recovery for that is typically not very encouraging, because in the adult body, neurons really don't reproduce all that well. All right, let's continue here. Well, in terms of neurons, we'll talk about some things that you already know about, but I'm going to put it in your notes nonetheless. We have the sensory neurons, right? Sensory neurons detect changes in the environment, detect changes in the internal or external environment. Okay. So as an example, right, you could have sensory neurons embedded in the dermal layer of your skin that allows you to detect cold air. But you could also have, okay, so that would be an example of an external environment, right? That would be an external environment scenario. But we could also have sensory neurons embedded in the wall of the primary artery of your body coming off your heart, which is the aorta. Okay, you have sensory receptors embedded in the fabric of the wall of the aorta, that every time the heart contracts and pushes blood into the aorta actually stretches. So these things are called stretch receptors, which are types of sensory receptors. Okay. Sensory neurons, also called stretch receptors, embedded in the aorta, again, the major artery coming off the heart, that allow you to detect changes in blood pressure. Okay, so you have a variety of stretch receptors spread throughout all the blood vessels of your body, and certainly a major category of them is in the aorta, coming right off the heart. When that aorta stretches, those sensory neurons, these stretch receptors, activate and send electrical signals up to your brain, and your brain becomes intimately aware of just how good or bad your blood pressure is. And then if that parameter, if blood pressure is out of the homeostatic window, the hypothalamus of the brain can create electrical signals to try to correct any potential imbalance. So, okay, that's getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but we have sensory receptors that allow us to detect the internal environment. Okay, let's continue here. Please feel free to ask questions along the way. We have motor neurons next. Okay, the motor neurons deliver commands from the central nervous system to an effector, which again is going to be a muscle or a gland. Deliver commands / instructions from the central nervous system to an effector, which is going to be muscle tissue or glandular tissue. All right. And then we also have what are called integrative neurons, which are also known as interneurons. You may have heard them called interneurons. We have integrative / interneurons. Okay. And these kinds of neurons help help process information being received into the central nervous system and allow your brain to actually make decisions about what should happen next. Okay, so you're only going to find the integrative neurons in the central nervous system because they help your brain make decisions. So these integrative or interneurons, you can refer to them either way, they help process, okay, sorry, my word processor put in the wrong thing, help process information being received into the central nervous system and make decisions about what should happen next. Okay? Help process information being received into the central nervous system and make decisions about what should happen next. Okay? All right. Let's continue. All right, so we're talking about basic terminology. Number one was neuron. And so within neuron, I subdivided that into sensory neurons, motor neurons, and integrative neurons. Number two is a neuroglial cell. Okay, this is a cell of the nervous system that cannot generate electrical signals. Okay, but they can, these neuroglial cells can reproduce, and they also serve to support and protect the health of the neurons. Okay. Okay, so neuroglial cells are cells of the nervous system that cannot generate electrical signals, but can reproduce. So that makes them different from the neurons, right? The neurons cannot reproduce, but the neuroglial cells can reproduce. The very general function of the neuroglial cells is to support the health and activity of the neurons. Okay. Let's see here. Sometimes the neuroglial cells are simply called glial cells. Okay, so if you see neuroglial or glial, we are in fact referring to the same thing. Okay. Bear with us, folks. There's a lot of tedious notes that we have to get into you today, and it's going to be very important that you spend significant time studying and organizing your knowledge. Okay, next we have a nerve. Well, a nerve is a bundle of many, I'm talking hundreds to thousands of axons that are part of the neuron. So a nerve is a bundle of many, we're talking hundreds to thousands of axons, okay? And if you don't know what an axon is, I think you do, but if you don't, you know it's a long extension, cytoplasmic extension from the body of a neuron, okay? And these nerves are typically associated with connective tissue and blood vessels that are part of the peripheral nervous system. Nerves are associated with connective tissue and blood vessels that are part of the peripheral nervous system. Okay? So by their nature, gang, by their nature, nerves can be part of the brain. They can be part of the spinal cord. They can be part of the peripheral tissue that comes off the spinal cord or the brain. Okay, so we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves that come out of the brain. And you're going to learn about them in future lab homework. Again, I want to encourage you to definitely do those lab assignments. They're going to help you get comfortable with the content. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves that come out of the brain. And there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves that come out of the spinal cord. Okay. All right. Gang, do you have any questions at this time? All right, you're very quiet today. I hope you're doing okay. Okay, so the next thing that we want to talk about is some of the nervous system histology. So this is going to take us on to page 406, 407, 408, 409. Okay, we need to talk about some of this nervous system histology. All right, so I think what we'll do first is talk about the neurons, and then we'll break it down and talk about the neuroglial cells. All right, so for our conversation right now, for the neurons, I think figure 12.2 on page 407 would be a useful thing for you to have and sitting in front of you so that you can put an eyeball on things as we list them into your notes. Okay. Figure 12.2 here. All right, so let's talk about the cell body. Okay. The cell body of a neuron, which you see as sort of the part of the neuron which has the most circular appearance to it, okay, the most circular appearance to it, is the part of the neuron which most typically represents the average eukaryotic cell that you learned about in chapter 3 of the book. Okay, this is the typical cell stuff that you learned about in chapter 3. This is the part of the neuron that is similar to the typical eukaryotic cell you learned about in chapter 3. Okay, in other words, the cell body contains the nucleus, it contains mitochondria, it contains the Golgi complex, right? It contains the lysosomes, it contains endoplasmic reticulum. You get the idea. Okay, so all the standard parts of a typical eukaryotic cell are certainly found and represented in the cell body of a neuron. Okay. Now, there's a special term that's going to start coming up in our chapter here together that's very important, and this term is ganglion. Folks, a ganglion is a collection of neuron cell bodies that lie outside the central nervous system. Okay, so we're going to encounter this phrase again, and I'll talk about it again in the future, but I'm going to put it in your notes right here so that you can start thinking about it. A ganglion is a collection of neuron cell bodies outside the central nervous system. So obviously that means they're in the peripheral nervous system, a collection of neuron cell bodies outside the central nervous system. That is a ganglion. Okay, let's continue here. There are some specific terms used for the microanatomy of a neuron that you need to be at least somewhat familiar with. First, we have Nissl bodies. Okay, you can see Nissl, N-I-S-S-L. Nissl bodies are shown to you on the middle part, part A of page 407. And when you talk about Nissl bodies, you're simply referring to the rough endoplasmic reticulum you find inside neurons. The Nissl bodies are simply a neuron-specific rough endoplasmic reticulum. Okay, so there are ribosomes there that can manufacture proteins. Number 3, the neurofibrils. Neurofibrils are part of the neuron cytoskeleton. Okay, they themselves, these neurofibrils are made of things called intermediate filaments. And remember, a filament is nothing more than a chain of protein. Nothing more than a chain of protein. So the neurofibrils are simply chains of protein. I'm going to give you a name of some proteins that are found in the neurofibrils, but don't worry about it. It's not a big deal for you at this time. Okay. These filaments are made of multiple proteins, including keratin. Okay. So, question coming through the chat window. What other part of the body did we encounter keratin? Okay, thank you. I know that at least you're not all asleep. Lindsay says the skin, right? Remember when we talked about the keratinocytes found in the epidermal layer of the skin? Okay, very good. Okay, so some of the proteins that are part of these neurofibrils include keratin, they include vimentin, they include desmin, peripherin, and lamin. Okay, so don't worry about it. I honestly wouldn't bother spending time memorizing that, but simply be aware of their existence. And of course, during your final exam, you will have your notes and textbook in front of you. Okay. Let's see, let's continue. Number 4, a nerve fiber. Okay, nerve fiber refers to any kind of extension off of the cell body. So, you probably already know about axons and dendrites. Well, axons and dendrites are examples of nerve fibers because they are both extensions off the cell body. Nerve fibers, any extension off the cell body. All right, so let's put in here that would include dendrites. Okay, dendrites are nerve fibers that receive information into the cell body of the neuron, into the neuron. Dendrites receive information into the neuron. Axons send information out of the neuron either towards another neuron it wants to communicate with, or in the case of a neuromuscular junction with a muscle cell, or in the case of, a glandular situation, a neuroglandular interaction, so that you release some kind of hormone or saliva in the mouth. Okay, so axons send information away from the neuron towards another neuron, muscle, or gland cell. All right. Now, there's a couple features of the axon that I want to highlight for you at this time because it may be helpful down the road when we're talking about other things like electrical signals. Okay, so within the axon, I want to highlight for you the axon hillock. Okay, axon hillock is shown to you on page 407. Okay, if you're looking at the cell body, you would look to the left and you would see the term mitochondrion, then you would see the term axon hillock, and then you'd see the term initial segment. So right now we're focusing on axon hillock. Okay. Okay. The axon hillock is it's the location where the axon begins to extend off the cell body. I mean, that entire extension that you see on page 407 is all part of the axon. It's all axon. But when you say axon hillock, you're talking about the region of the axon that initially extends off the cell body. And what's important for you to appreciate is the axon hillock is actually the anatomical location of the neuron that is the typical site of electrical signal creation, or the so-called nerve impulse generation. It typically happens at the axon hillock. This is the usual location where new electrical signals are generated, allowing the neuron to communicate to other cells. Okay. Now, if you know anything about electrical signals in the nervous system, the first step in generating an electrical signal is to allow sodium ions in across the membrane into the cell, and that's a step that we're going to learn about called depolarization. Well, in the axon hillock, that area of the plasma membrane of the neuron has an unusually high abundance of sodium ion channels, meaning that that anatomical location of the neuron is more prone, more capable of creating that very first electrical cascade that we need for a nerve impulse. Okay. The axon hillock anatomy has more sodium ion channels than other areas of the axon, allowing it to, let me back up, giving it the ability to create electrical signals easier than other areas of the neuron. Okay. The axon hillock anatomy has more sodium channels than other areas of the axon, giving it the ability to create electrical signals easier than other areas of the neuron. Okay, any questions, gang? All right. Last thing that I want to mention or draw to your attention to about the axons is the very end of the axons where the neurotransmitter is going to be released. These are in fact called synaptic end bulbs. Okay, the synaptic end bulbs is the very end of the axon terminals. Okay, so you can see at the bottom left corner of page 407, take a look at those spiny little projections called axon terminals. They come off or branch off the main axon, and then even those axon terminals have a final rounded structure at their end called the synaptic end bulbs. So the synaptic end bulbs are the very end of the axon terminals, and these end bulbs contain special substances you know as neurotransmitters, okay? Okay, so another question coming through the chat window. If I can type properly. Okay, what kind of neurotransmitter is found in the synaptic end bulb of an axon at a neuromuscular junction? Okay, thank you, Jennifer. ACH, short for acetylcholine. Very, very nice. Okay, now obviously there are many, many different kinds of neurotransmitters in the nervous system, not just acetylcholine, although certainly acetylcholine is a major neurotransmitter. There's many others. And the kind of neurotransmitter you find in any given neuron depends on what the neuron's function is and where it's anatomically positioned in the body. And it is possible that some neurons have been documented to have, 2, 3, or even more than 3 neurons in the same cell. So it gets complicated as to how the cell knows when to release which neurotransmitter. Okay, folks, do you have any questions about the neuron anatomy at this time that you see on page 407? Okay, let's continue. We're going to switch gears. We're going to switch gears from neurons, and now we're going to go to neuroglial cells. So letter B is going to be neuroglial cells. Neuroglia for short. Okay. Now within neuroglia, we've got to talk about neuroglia that are part of the central nervous system, and later on we have to talk about neuroglia that are part of the peripheral nervous system. So bear with me again. These are somewhat tedious notes, but we can't hide from the complexity of the human body. It is an amazing machine that is in part amazing because of just how complicated it is. All right, so neuroglia of the central nervous system. And let's see here. Probably page 410, 411 would be things that would be helpful for you to look at this time. Okay. So let's take the first one. First we have, okay, we're talking about the neuroglia of the central nervous system. First we have a type of neuroglia called an astrocyte. Okay, astrocytes. Astrocytes are found in the central nervous system, and they help maintain the integrity of the blood-brain barrier, which you may know is itself made of endothelial cells that make up your capillary beds in the central nervous system. And the whole function of the blood-brain barrier is to prevent potentially harmful substances from getting into the central nervous system and damaging your nervous tissue. So, okay, in the central nervous system, the astrocytes help maintain the integrity of the blood-brain barrier to prevent harmful substances from damaging neurons. Okay, in the central nervous system, astrocytes help maintain the integrity of the blood-brain barrier, whose function it is to prevent harmful substances from damaging neurons. Okay. In embryos, the astrocytes are known to play a role in helping the developing brain tissue form different cell-to-cell connections, so-called neuronal connections. Okay, in embryos, astrocytes help the developing brain form cell-to-cell connections, so-called neuronal connections. In addition to these functions, astrocytes help maintain the chemical environment necessary for neurons to generate nerve impulses. Okay, when I say nerve impulse, if that's foreign to you, you know, nerve impulse is it is an electrical signal. Okay. More specifically, what the astrocytes are capable of doing is regulating the concentration of potassium and a variety of neurotransmitters that are found in the fluid outside the cells, the so-called interstitial fluid. Okay, the astrocytes regulate the concentrations of potassium, so K plus ions, and neurotransmitters that are present in the interstitial fluid. Okay, we haven't talked in any detail yet about communication in the nervous system, but you know that there's two forms of communication in the nervous system. There's these electrical signals that are called nerve impulses, and then there's these biochemical signals, which are basically the neurotransmitters that spread from one cell to the next. Interstitial fluid. Okay, and finally, it seems increasingly likely, although it's not 100% because there's still a lot of things we don't know, there's still a lot of research continuing, it seems likely that the astrocytes may play a role in forming synaptic connections that are necessary for learning, so that you can learn a new concept, such as how a muscle contracts. You can learn that. If you've learned it, if your brain has processed it and you understand it, certainly the astrocytes in your brain played a role in your learning of that content, as well as your memory, simply being able to create a memory so that you know what the axon hillock of an axon is. If you can remember that, in part you can thank the astrocytes for that. So astrocytes may play a role in the formation of neural synapses, important for learning and for memory. Okay. So, at this point, there's nothing all that fancy about, astrocytes. I mean, you can see astrocytes on figure 12.6, page 411. You can see there that there's various categories of astrocytes. There are fibrous astrocytes there along the left-hand side, and there are protoplasmic astrocytes. Okay, so with even within astrocytes, there are subcategories of astrocytes. Okay, it's not always easy to visually distinguish one kind of cell from another, and so what you really have to rely on in the research lab is a difference in the cell's gene expression, which tells you more detail about the cell's behavior, what it's actually trying to accomplish. Gang, do you have any questions about astrocytes? Okay. Oh dear. Okay. I see that I am in fact out of time. Okay. All right, folks. Here's the deal. Moving forward. Next. Okay. So Wednesday there is no lecture because your job is to take your lecture exam. Okay. Wednesday there will be no lecture. Please do not log into Zoom at 8 a.m. because we won't be holding a lecture. So please take your lecture exam Wednesday, but there is no lecture. Jennifer, I saw your question. Next Monday when we come back, excuse me a second, I'm going to sneeze. Excuse me. When we come back next Monday, I'm going to finish up some basic notes on the anatomy that I've been giving you, and then we're going to start going into the physiology of the electrical signals of the nervous system big time. Okay, so expect in the next 2 lectures on this content to be fairly heavy in terms of understanding the physiology of nerve impulses. Okay, so I know you're concerned with studying for the lecture exam on Wednesday, and you should be. But after you do that and give yourself a moment of rest, please be sure you've really dug into chapter 12 so you can follow along with our conversation. Jennifer's question, are we going over lab answers today? The answer to that is yes. If you have completed your lab homework for lab exercises, let me see here, lab exercises, oh, let's see here. Okay, looking at the new schedule. Okay, yeah, there are no lab exercises that are due today. Okay, so let me put a kibosh on that. We will go over the answers to lab homework exercises 16 and 17 next week. Okay. However, I still will be available online for anybody that needs some help. If you have questions about anything for the lecture exam coming up, I would be happy to chat with you. So Jennifer has a question on the study guide. Number 4 is a matching essay about joint motion, and number 3 about joint motion. Isn't that the same thing? Well, they are 2 different questions about the same topic. I will be asking different aspects of joint motion and testing you 2 different ways about joint motion. So essays 3 and 4 have the common idea of joint motion, but I'm not going to be testing you exactly the same way. Okay, and the question is about, is the material from today going to be on lecture exam 2? No, it will not be on lecture exam 2. Chapter 12 is the first chapter that's part of your final exam. Okay. So Jennifer asks about the neurotransmitter junction. Does that mean it's the 10 steps you showed us? Well, that and potentially more, Jennifer. Okay, I'm going to be asking you to think. Do you have other questions? Okay. All right, gang. I'm sorry I went over a little bit of extra time here today, but so here's what we'll do. We'll take about a 12 to 15 minute break here, and I'll be back online with you at about 9:35. If you have things that you want my help with, if you want to talk to me about any content or anything at all, I will be back and I'll be happy to chat with you. Okay. One last time, are there any other questions before we close up the lecture portion of our time today? All right, gang. Then I'll be happy to chat with you in 15 minutes. Otherwise, stay well and remember lecture exam on Wednesday. So I'll see you soon. Okay, folks. So we're back here together. Is there anything that I can help you with at this time? Ashley, Mosana?
I had a question about vitamin D synthesis. At one point, I have that vitamin D3 is the precursor to calcitriol, and then in another part of my notes, I have that it's formed from 7-dehydrocholesterol. So is that the same thing as D3, or what's the difference between the two chemicals?
Okay, one moment, Ashley. Let me get my notes. Okay, so please ask your question again.
So I was wondering what the difference was between vitamin D3 and 7-dehydrocholesterol, because I had both of them written down as calcitriol being formed from them.
Okay, so vitamin D3 is made from 7-dehydrocholesterol. Now, how they're actually different, we would have to go into their chemical structures, which I don't want to do. But vitamin D3 is made from 7-dehydrocholesterol. Does that help? Okay. All right. Anything else you want me to address on that topic? Okay. All right. Okay. What else can I help you with?